Good day, ladies and gents, wherever you may be around the world, and welcome to this special stream on British policy, 1914-1941, Winston Churchill, and the Washington Naval Treaty, which is largely based on Pat Buchanan's book, Hitler, Churchill, and the Unnecessary War. Apologies from me. The reason we are late is my fault. It is 5:30 a.m. here, and I got up 10 minutes late. That's why we're late. So I'm sorry. And if indeed we are late and gay, it's me who's gay. So there we go. Welcome to my guest, Horus. Horus, how are you going, mate?
Good evening, Duke. Yeah. Thanks for inviting me to this. I'm sorry it took us so long. It took me so long to be ready for it. But it should be interesting. I'm very interested in the interwar period and so on. So yeah.
Yeah, it's as I was saying to you before we went live, it's partly a follow-up to a stream that you can find in our back catalogue, which is Splendid Isolation. It's John Chalmley's book looking at British foreign policy between 1874 and 1914. And as I said to you, Horace, what I regard as the original sin of Britain and the Empire was joining the First World War in 1914. So it's kind of a bit of a carry on from that one. I believe Ataman's going to be joining us shortly, but because I messed up the timing of this, like I said, it's 5:32 a.m. and I should have had all this done half an hour ago. He'll join us in due course. Horace, what's your opening position on this stuff then?
Well, are we focusing a fair bit on Winston Churchill, or a little more broadly than that?
I'm certainly going to be talking about Winston Churchill because he was absolutely dead keen for Britain joining the war in 1914. Obviously, he was dead keen for Britain joining the war in 1939. I'm not a big Winston Churchill fan, not at all. That would be an understatement, as anyone who knows me would say. We're certainly going to be looking at him, but I mean, let's go back to like the summer of 1914 to start with, and give us your view on what should have been going on. Should Britain have joined World War One? That kind of stuff.
No, yeah, we are in agreement there, and Buchanan in this book makes a very, very strong case against Britain joining either of the world wars. And Buchanan is someone, I mean, he's been condemned for this book. I mean, he was even called an anti-Semite, even that's irrelevant to this book. But he is quite a mainstream guy. I mean, he's about as right-wing as the mainstream goes, but still he is within the mainstream, as far as I understand. And he makes an excellent case against Britain's role in both the wars, not from any sort of pro-German perspective. Well, not from any pro-Hitler perspective anyway, and he condemns Hitler. But he's a very, very good revisionist. Buchanan really helped set me on a path to re-examining a lot of things because it's revisionism without endorsing, dictatorship, warmongering, crimes against civilians and stuff. It's revisionism from what I would say is the right point of view, which is what is actually good for our nations, what is actually good for our civilization as a whole. He puts a lot of blame for the causes of the First World War on Edward Grey and Winston Churchill when it comes to Britain. He makes a point, especially of showing how delighted Churchill was when he realised that the war was going to happen, and certainly afterwards, and once it was underway, he was really thrilled, which implies to me some psychopathy or something. It's demented. One thing I think Buchanan doesn't go into a great deal is obviously the role of France. I think all through the last century and more, France, or from Britain's perspective, Britain's willingness to work with France, has just been the problem so many times, and continuing up to now as well. And I don't mean the French nation. I mean, French people are as fine as anyone else in the world, as far as I know. But French politics seems to me even more contemptible than ours. It's they are the cause of problems, and I think their aggression and their sort of bitter attitude towards Germany is underrated by most historians. Buchanan doesn't really go into that either. But yeah, in terms of Britain's choices, I mean, yeah, the finger is pointed squarely at Edward Grey and Winston Churchill, both in this and Churchill in many, many later instances as well, all through the interwar period, and in terms of his hostility towards Germany in the 30s, and in how he conducted himself in the First and Second World Wars, both as a politician and specifically his military decisions, just awful. A whole career of disasters. And it's a disgrace and embarrassment that he's as venerated as he is. As I've argued in many videos that have alienated some people, but I stand by him. Oh, sorry, I dropped out for a second there. I hope you can hear me all right.
That was my fault, Horace. Good evening, Armin. How you going, mate?
Yeah, good, you?
Yeah, I'm good, mate. Just to reply to Horace, I broadly agree with what he said there. I mean, the real architect of Britain joining the First World War in 1914 was Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, as Buchanan points out in his book. And there were secret agreements to send the British Expeditionary Force, i.e. the British Army, across the Channel to fight alongside the French Army, which the British cabinet did not know about. John Commonus in the chat asked, was Britain really under any obligation to support Belgium in World War One? Well, not really, because, France and Germany and various other countries were also supposed to support Belgian independence. So, and neutrality. So, Britain was under no more obligation to support Belgium than Germany was, and Germany was invading them, for God's sake. It was an excuse, and it was the Entente Cordiale with first France and then Russia, which was really used to drag Britain into World War One. And as I said earlier, I regard that as the original sin of Britain and the Empire, to be honest. And I think most of Britain's ills since that time have resulted from that choice in 1914. Ataman, what's your view on that stuff, mate?
Well, to come back directly on that point, don't you think though it was definitely more? I mean, I'm gonna do a little bit of devil's advocacy here, right? Don't you think it was a little bit more in our interest to keep Belgium as a buffer zone on our flank than it was in Germany's interest?
I mean, I suppose, yes, but it wasn't in Britain's interest to get almost 1 million Empire dead in World War One.
No.
So, and it would have been much more in Britain's interest for Germany to win the war in probably 1915, if we're honest. Do something like she did in the 1870 Franco-Prussian War. Possibly take a few French colonies away, and that would have been the end of that. I don't see Germany being much worse than that, to be honest, in World War One. But that's just my view. You guys can argue that's not true if you like.
I know I'm opening up a big controversy here that's not necessarily the subject of this stream, but I mean, would you guys, like, firstly, analytically, would you say that Britain's policy of balance of power on the continent and trying to ensure that no one power becomes dominant, which, when it comes to 1914, the power that had the potential to do that was Germany, obviously. Do you think that was a factor in causing the First World War, and do you think it ought to have been, or do you think Britain should have changed its policy before then? I mean, because I made a series of videos about the causes of the Second World War, and it was argued. I think Brutus argued that was still a factor then, and he said it was right. That policy was justified.
I think it's kind of doomed to fail as a strategy, isn't it? I mean, regardless of whether it took us into either war or not, it's just that's always going to fail as a strategy because of, for geographic reasons.
I think also you've got to bear in mind that this balance of power argument, which one sees all the time and indeed sees even to this very day, is it's a Churchill argument. It's Winston Churchill in his books who argues Britain traditionally had this policy. I don't think Britain did traditionally have this policy. Britain sometimes supported the most powerful nations sometimes didn't. There was no particular reason for Britain to be anti-German, except at the beginning of the 20th century, the Kaiser very, very foolishly decided to build the German high seas fleet. Had Germany not done that, then I think it's quite possible Britain and Germany would not have become enemies. Because that was the, I mean, all right, by 1913, the Germans had admitted they couldn't win. You know, the very efficient British shipbuilders and the Royal Navy had decisively won the dreadnought race. And by 1913, even the German Admiral Tirpitz was turning around and saying, all right, well, Germany's going to accept 60% of the Royal Navy size because we can't both build up our army to fight Russia and France and build up a navy to try and rival the Royal Navy. So Britain had won that by 1913, and that issue had gone away, but it was too late by then. In the late 1890s and the early 1900s, that was the reason that Britain and Germany first became enemies, because you've got to remember, like, prior to this era, if you go back to the Napoleonic Wars, Britain and Prussia were basically friends. And even before that, at the time of the 7 Years' War, what our American friends would call the French and Indian Wars, Britain and Prussia were friends. So, you know.
I mean, kind of in a way, you could say that the power balance between countries was the ultimate balance of power policy anyway, because we never had the army to do anything on the continent pre-World War One. Yeah, and they never had the naval power to do anything to us at sea. So,
yeah, as Lord Salisbury, the British Prime Minister, said, we are fish in terms of Britain. You know, Britain is a whale. It's a seagoing nation. It's an island. It depends on its Royal Navy, and Germany was a vast land power.
It does make me wonder whether there could have been a partnership that could have, you know, I mean, it's a bit rude to say in the current age, but basically ruled the world together. It probably would have had to partner with Germany, with America as well. Well, Britain and Germany before, you know, instead of fighting each other.
Horus, the Kaiser suggested exactly that. The trouble is the Kaiser would say that sort of thing occasionally, and then he would lose his brain and do things like the Kruger telegram, which pissed off everyone in Britain. You know,
which has got a parallel with Hitler sending Ribbentrop in the 30s, right? And again, antagonising all the important people in Britain.
Yeah, because Ribbentrop wasn't a popular guy and wasn't a particularly nice guy. So yeah. Absolutely.
And he hated the British apparently as well.
Well, I'm not sure if he hated the British, but yeah, I do see what you're saying.
Yeah, he had some sort of resentment or something. And he also pretended to be aristocratic, didn't he? He called himself von Ribbentrop.
I believe he did, and yes, it was, I think, mostly made up. But yeah, I mean, the Britain and Germany certainly could have been allies in the 1890s. But when Britain first started looking for allies, around the time in 1902, when Britain signed the Anglo-Japanese naval agreement, which worked very well for Britain during the First World War, for example. Germany thought that if we wait longer and we build our navy even more, the British will even more beg to be our allies. And of course, the British didn't do that at all. They just outbuilt their navy by building more dreadnought battleships than the than the Germans could possibly build. So yeah, so it didn't work from that point of view. Ataman, you got anything to add on that bit, mate?
No. I suppose, I mean, like, there was a lot of obviously most people just say not to go into World War One to begin with.
Yes, absolutely.
I think another particular big problem was actually allowing America to become physically involved, and then giving them that powerful seat of negotiation at the end of the war.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know whether you saw Ataman on the Discord. I was talking about this on the Discord a bit, like 3 hours ago, before I tried to get 2 hours sleep before 5 a.m., which didn't go too well. But I was talking about this on the Discord. I don't totally agree with Patrick Buchanan's views in the unnecessary war. There are bits I don't agree with, and one of the things I don't agree with is that Buchanan claims the Americans won World War One. Yeah, the vast numbers of American soldiers arriving in Europe in 1918 certainly did do in the morale of the German general staff. It did. But most of those soldiers never got into the trenches and never saw any action. If you look at the guys who actually defeated the vast German counterattacks in 1918, which they were able to do, of course, because of the communists in Russia, which meant that they could shift loads of troops who had been on the Eastern Front to the Western Front. The troops who stopped those vast German attacks were British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand for the most part. And then it was the same British, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand old Commonwealth troops who did the 100 Days campaign, which chased the German army back almost to the German border. You know, there was no stab in the back. That was a Nazi myth. The German army was defeated in 1918, and it was mostly defeated by the British and old Commonwealth soldiers. But you know, that's my view. Horus,
yeah, but
Ataman,
a lot of those German troops did kind of come back to some really rough times back in Germany.
Oh yeah,
you know, like
they did.
huge
No, they
unrest and units fighting units and.
Yep, absolutely. I'm not going to argue against that for a second. The point I'm trying to make is they were defeated in 1918.
Yeah,
and they were mostly defeated by British and old Commonwealth soldiers. That's the only point I'm making.
That is the element of the stab in the back myth that is completely false, isn't it? I mean, they really were beaten. They gave in because they needed to, because if they gave in later, they would have had less and less and less good terms. And then,
the Commonwealth, British and old Commonwealth troops would have been across the German border and actually into Germany if they had given in later. Yeah, they gave in before they were invaded.
No, so if they'd gone on longer, they might have had an even worse settlement than what came out of Versailles. What I said at the start about the French, though, whenever I think of Versailles, I think mostly of Clemenceau. He's the one who seems to have got his way most of all, and his spirit was just I guess it's what you'd expect from France, in that it had been, during Napoleon's time, the most powerful thing in the world, and then by the time, a century later, they were a failure. Like, France was a failure. They basically got destroyed twice. So they only exist now because Britain and then obviously Russia and the Soviet Union and the USA jumped in and saved them. Like, France would have actually been eliminated from the world, more or less.
Yeah, for sure. They would have lost in 1915 at latest without Britain and the Empire. For absolute certain, I agree with you.
And this is to say nothing disparaging of French troops. I think they're as brave as anyone.
Absolutely,
there's this myth, isn't there, that the French are cowards or that they're just a pushover. It's not that.
Not true at all. They just didn't have the manpower to fight Germany on their own.
Yeah. In which case, I would say, I'm talking a little vaguely here, but the solution for France at many points in sort of the first half of the century would have been to seek friendship and peace with Germany. But for some reason, they always, maybe I'm missing something, but for some reason, they always see the Germans just in terms of threat, not in terms of opportunity.
Go back even to Napoleon, for example. And Napoleon was hugely interfering in Germany. There's a good channel on YouTube called Apostolic Majesty that you can go and look at the French Revolution and Napoleon's foreign policy and what have you. And the French were interfering under Napoleon hugely in what was going on in Germany, for example. So this was kind of a traditional thing. And by the time you get the 1870 Franco-Prussian War, which was really a Franco-German war, because most of the German smaller states supported Prussia, almost all of them, in fact. This was going to happen. But, Britain stayed out of that war, as I believe we should have stayed out of World War I, and nothing bad happened because of it to Britain.
I think like if Britain had stayed out of the First World War, which obviously it seems like the Prime Minister and most of the cabinet, would have done were it not for Grey and Churchill scheming, and it was scheming as well, as you said, they did it in secret.
Yeah.
I think like France probably would have just made a peace with Germany pretty quickly. They would have had to maybe give some money or whatever, but it would have been a limited war like in the old style. It's like Britain's entry into it, and obviously France's alliance with Russia as well, but Britain's entry into it especially made it what it was, made it a world war rather than just another Franco-German war.
Yes,
It would have been so much more.
I entirely agree. Could I ask you, Horace, because Jonathan Bowden, who's a friend of the channel, has asked in the chat, can you name the Irving book where he cites a Hitler quote saying that Britain and Germany should conquer the US together? I always chuckle at that, but I can't remember the book now. I have no idea what Irving book that is. I wonder if you do.
I haven't read most of his books. I would guess Hitler's War, probably. That's the most likely one, or Churchill's War, perhaps.
Fair enough. I've read a bit of Irving, and I think he's a bit like the curate's egg. He's good in parts,
Very lively, extremely, very readable. Yeah. Like, he makes it like a thrilling story. Like,
yeah, he's very, very, very readable. He's an intelligent bloke. Sometimes he tells the truth, and other times I don't agree with him. But I mean, that's like most authors, as far as I'm concerned. So
it's very strongly favourable to the Germans.
He is. I would also say we've got Utiz 4321 in the chat. The French stopped the best army in the world in 1914, basically alone. BF was a minor player till 1915. Yeah, I tell you what though, mate. The Schifflin plan. Now, the Schifflin plan was to keep the German right wing strong, okay? And the guys who stopped the German right wing were the BEF, because they could fire 15 to 30 aim rounds a minute, and the Germans thought they had hundreds of machine guns when actually they only had 2 to a battalion, because they were so well trained following the disasters of the Anglo-Boer War that the Germans were still attacking in platoon columns, for God's sake, which the British troops couldn't believe. And the guys who actually stopped the right wing of the German Schifflin plan were the British Expeditionary Force, who were probably the finest soldiers ever to walk the earth, until they were mostly killed by the mincing machine of the German artillery. But that's just me. You got anything to say about that stuff, guys? Ataman, Horus?
No, I did, because you posted some stuff up about the British Army transition from the Anglo-Boer War, didn't you? I watched a few of them, and they were pretty good. It was a good like you can see this in Ernst Jünger, actually. I know I bring him up a lot, but I mean he really bigs up sort of British troops in the First World War. He almost makes them sound like super soldiers.
Ernst Jünger, who wrote Storm of Steel, which is a great war book, which I'm quite certain that Horus will have read. I presume he would have.
It's been on my list for years. I'm sorry, I've not read it yet.
Man, you've got to read Storm of Steel. And
I'm going on holiday next week. I'll read that then.
It's actually a great book. It's very entertaining, and it's one of the great war books. And it's not especially an anti-war book. I mean, Ernst Jünger kind of liked it, But what he does point out is the people who he admired were the people he was flaying, who were the Brits. Like and as Ataman just said, he bigs up the Brits all the way through the book. He says, "Look, these guys were really brave and good and well trained and all this kind of stuff."
Was it him who said the English fight like lions?
Quite possibly.
No, I think that's because that's wait, well, I can't remember where that comes from, but no,
it was someone else, wasn't it?
Yeah, but also, I mean, the Ernst Jünger thing, I think, kind of feeds into the question you got up on screen as well, like the overarching question of why white nations were fighting each other. I mean, you can look at, this is a comparison I bring up a lot. You can look at a book that was a big deal in Britain after the First World War, a book that was probably pushed, but also a book that was also just well received, which was All Quiet on the Western Front.
Oh yeah.
And you can look at a book that had the same reception in Germany, which is Storm of Steel. And they're so radically different books. They're such radically different books. You can almost kind of get a sense just from reading through them why Germany could have such a strong reaction following the war in the National Socialists, and why Britain, on the other hand, just kind of carried on down the same path it had gotten stuck in.
I think we've got to point out that, like, All Quiet on the Western Front, which is a famous book and movie these days, has been at least, 2-3 versions done by Hollywood. And that book was, the movie at least, I'm not sure about the book to be honest, but the movie was certainly banned by the Nazis after 1933 in Germany. Whereas the Nazis rather liked Ernst Junger and Storm of Steel, but Ernst Junger didn't like the Nazis very much. It's quite strange that they wanted to big him up. They would have liked him to be like a big deal for Germany after 1933 when Hitler became Chancellor. And Ernst Junger wasn't interested. He didn't like the Nazis. So
I think he was a bit too German Empire pilled and pro-Kaiser to sort of go down.
Yeah, he was an aristocrat. I mean, Ernst Junger was a traditional kind of German Junker aristocrat type chap. So yeah, absolutely.
I think in answer. Oh, sorry, Ataman, were you going to say something?
No. Please carry on.
Just in answering this question, why were white nations fighting each other? I think this bears upon something that carried on after the First World War, up until now, which is, I think, people like Winston Churchill, Arthur Balfour, and others. Patrick Buchanan talks about this somewhat. They really, really believed in this, what seems to me 100% mythical, this idea of the special relationship, or the idea of the unity of the English-speaking peoples, or the... Are you clapping?
I am. I'm agreeing. Yeah, it was.
There's another term they use, like the Anglo-Saxon unity as well, or something. This idea that, I mean, they're obviously not racial thinkers, right? They did not identify with Europe or with white people. They probably wouldn't use the word white people, but they did use the term English-speaking peoples. And they, I think, were like, Winston Churchill, particularly his behaviour in the Second World War, suggests that he had like a kind of racial hatred. I don't know if that's the right term, but a real hatred of German people, like contempt for ordinary German people. And so we are, I mean, well, I don't speak for you two guys, but we're probably more inclined to see it as a tragedy that millions of Germans, millions of Brits, millions of French died fighting each other for what, not only was it all for nothing, it was all like it's actually left us much worse off than we presumably would have been otherwise.
100%.
Yeah, and so someone like Winston Churchill, that's not a loss. He just only thinks in terms of like Britain, America, and probably to a lesser extent Canada, US, Australia, and New Zealand, and so on. That sort of thinking, I think, made it very easy. Like, and even like something to be celebrated that we're having a war against the Krauts, the Bosch,
All right. Well, look. This is, I suppose, one of the central questions we're going to be addressing here. So I'm going to highlight Jonathan Bowden's comment, which I put up in the chat. The overarching question is, why were white nations fighting each other? He's talking about 1914 and 18, obviously. Look at us now, a bankrupted continent in energy poverty, overrun by Muslims, Arabs, and blacks. Don't disagree with anything Jonathan Bowden says there, who is a good friend of the channel and a friend of mine, I might add. I would just say this. Look, one thing Buchanan does a good job of in that book is pointing out that the so-called, in inverted commas, special relationship between Britain and America is entirely an upper-class British invention. Like, the Americans never really believed in it at all. Never have.
What does it refer to? What concrete thing?
Exactly. Well, I mean, presumably, the Americans rebelling against the Brits, killing loyalists, during
the British are coming.
War. Yeah.
Well, this is a thing. There's another book in this.
Hang on, Am.
Yeah.
You can even get like modern movies by people like Mel Gibson, where they take stuff that the Germans did in Europe in World War II and pretend the Brits did it to the Americans, or like burning people to death in churches, which the Brits never did against the Americans. Trust me. Complete fiction. The Germans did that against people they didn't like. The Brits never did.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there's another book that comes up in these circles as well, which is Hitchens' The Phony Victory, and he talks quite a lot of Americans essentially accosting us in the sort of interwar period, and causing drama and agitating in many ways.
Well, we're going to get onto that, Ataman, because that's why I included the Washington Naval Treaty and what have you in this stream. And I know that Horus, for example, has watched an hour-long video on the Washington Naval Treaty, so we'll get onto that in due course. But yeah, I mean, there was no special relationship between the Brits and the Americans as late as actually in World War II in 1942. One of the American war aims was the destruction of the British Empire, who they probably rightly saw as an enemy and somebody who they wanted to get rid of in terms of trade. And one of the things I want to bring out is that Britain supported free trade far too long. Like nearly every major country had got rid of it by the second half of the 19th century. But Britain was still, free trade. When even in 1898, there was the Spanish-American War, and Britain was the only European nation which was neutral rather than pro-Spanish. Like Britain was entirely neutral. We didn't care if the Americans or the Spanish won the Spanish-American War. But when America took over the Philippines and Cuba and Puerto Rico, etc., what Britain found was that increasingly America brought in a protectionism stuff that pushed out all British trade. And that was what every nation did. The Germans did it, the Americans did it, the French did it, all major nations did that except Britain. And Britain kept on with free trade when we should have ended it absolutely at the latest in the 1880s. We should have said, no, this doesn't work.
I appreciate you refer to policy of not levying any sort of import duties or anything, even if other countries are doing that against you.
Yes.
And so the alternative is to move to what is it? Imperial preference? Is that the right term?
That was the exact. Look, this is my big deal. You'll see me talking quite often about imperial tariff preference, which was what Britain wanted to come out with in the very early years of the 20th century. And what caused Winston Churchill, who is not my favorite British person, or really half American person, to be more accurate, to leave the so-called Conservative Party and cross the floor and join the Liberals, which he did, of course, in 1906, I think. And it was it 1908? But anyway, round about then. He left the Conservative Party and joined the Liberals because of imperial tariff preference. And imperial tariff preference was really designed to try and turn the old Commonwealth, and the old Commonwealth, for anyone who doesn't know, was Britain, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, and back in those days, also South Africa, into something politically real rather than just we kind of like each other and we got the same king or queen, and the Liberals hated it, and Winston Churchill, as I said, crossed the floor, left the Conservative Party, joined the Liberals because of that, which is one reason why Conservatives in the 1930s didn't trust Winston Churchill at all, and quite rightly, in my opinion. But there we go. Carry on, gents.
Well, yeah, he rejoined the Tories in about 1920. 1 or 2, is that right? Is that when Stanley Baldwin first came in?
Something like that, yeah. Well, you mean he rejoined the Tories when he wanted to stay in power and the Tories were in power, so yeah.
He praises himself for doing so as well.
Of course, at that stage, like when the general strike happened in, what was it, 26, 27? Churchill said, "Give me a whip and I'll whip them back to work." Great guy, Churchill. Great guy, Churchill.
And there's other instances of him using armed police and in one case, I think, armed forces as well against striking civilians. The Tony Pandy riots in Wales. I don't know much about it, but he actually sent troops against striking.
Oh, yeah.
I don't know. You're kind of selling me on the guy now.
Well, one thing I find, since you mentioned about the free trade thing, Duke, I know Joseph Chamberlain in the sort of turn of the century was one of the people leading.
He was the guy who was really leading the charge for imperial tariff preference.
Right. And so, I mean, Austin Chamberlain was his son alongside Neville, right? And Austin Chamberlain is mentioned in Buchanan's book. I can't remember exactly. Oh, yeah. Austin Chamberlain believed in this sort of Anglo-Saxon unity crap. I mean, it sounds nice. I like that.
No, I believe in it. I believe in Anglo-Celtic unity if you're going to look at the British Empire. So you're going to look at the old Commonwealth. So Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back then South Africa. If that had been what you were looking at, I would totally agree with it.
And that is a fine empire as well. I mean,
yeah, absolutely right.
Proud of.
Those bits I would absolutely agree with. America wasn't part of it.
No, I think they're different men. They're completely separate and a lot of the time oppositional mentality towards Britain. That I think that's just continuous since the revolution and probably further back. Like, I mean, the revolution took a long time to brew as well, maybe like 100 years before that. I don't know, when has America ever been pro-British? I mean, you know, they can make pro-British noises like when Tony Blair goes over there or something, you know. But
well, was America pro-British in 1956 during the Suez crisis? Not that I recall.
They grabbed us by the throat, basically, like wrestled us to the ground and booted us.
Well, to be honest, I think like Britain could have turned around and said to the Americans, "Well, do your worst," and carried on. But Eden wasn't wanting to do that.
And also, Britain shouldn't have been doing what it was doing in the Suez, as far as I can see.
Oh, no, I don't agree with that at all. I was entirely in support of it. But
actually, I'm not really sure. I've been swayed by reading Douglas Reed's book, The Controversy of Zion, but that's only one.
I just think Eden should have turned around and said to the Americans, "All right, guys, if you want to kill your biggest, most important ally, go for it," which is kind of what Mrs. Thatcher did in 1982. When the Americans wanted to be even-handed between Britain and Argentina, Mrs. Thatcher turned around and said, "Look, you can either support your most important and biggest ally, Britain, or you can support this Argentine yonder," you know?
Yeah, she really had to persist with that as well.
Yeah, but that is what Eden should have done in 56, and he didn't. He just gave in.
Yeah, Margaret Thatcher was extremely tenacious. She, because Ronald Reagan, and especially, what was it? Who was his Secretary of State at the time? It was like George Shultz or something. They were literally flying around from Argentina to Britain and everywhere, just trying to get Britain to just accept our territory being invaded.
Mrs. Thatcher, partly because the professional head of the Royal Navy had marched into her office in full Royal Navy uniform and said, "Prime Minister, the Royal Navy can put together a task force which will take back the Falkland Islands," and of course he was correct. Who had joined the Royal Navy in like 1937. Mrs. Thatcher said, "No, all right, we're going to do that." And because she listened to her advisors back then, you know.
Yeah, she was still, her cabinet was mostly still full of wets at that point as well. She tried.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, it was. Like Mrs. Thatcher had the biggest balls in the cabinet, and she was a woman, so you know.
And then she won the war and got rid of all the wets as well. Not enough. She got rid of the wets out of her cabinet. Unfortunately, she didn't sort out the party, and then they got their revenge a few years later. But,
yeah, absolutely. Anyway, we're going a bit off track here, but I mean, like, it's inevitable, I guess. But my point is the whole special relationship nonsense with America is a group of rich and generally socially upper class Brits who somehow or another thought that the Americans were our cousins, when America, for the most part, hated the British Empire, detested it. I don't know, Ataman, you haven't said much for a while. I don't know what your view of that is.
Well, yeah, I mean, you were saying earlier about like this belief that it was built on the Anglo-Saxon peoples, but of course, I mean, America ceased to be really an Anglo-Saxon nation quite a bit earlier. You know, they just had this huge influx of other continentals who were exerting huge amounts of influence on it. I mean, you know, there's a lot of myths that get thrown around about like the horrific treatment of like the Irish in America, even though from quite early on there was a huge amount of Irish people in the various halls of power there. So that you know that impacted the idea that it was really an Anglo-Saxon nation. And then of course there was the fact that, I mean, if you go a bit down the sort of James Burnham line of thinking, which I generally agree with, is that they were actively, during the interwar period, going through a process of purging whatever last vestiges of an Anglo-Saxon elite they still had.
Look, I would just say this before I bring Horus back in. Some of you chaps will have watched a stream yesterday, which I'm glad to say Lady of Shalott was on, because she was the person who kept it a bit real, about the troubles in Northern Ireland. Like, obviously, academic agent had no idea what was going on there, and Thomas 777 did what Thomas 777 does, which is like go on and on and on. Make
I
a lot
think
of
you're
noise.
too harsh on the guy, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan, I got to say, because like I see him making a lot of historical mistakes. But
I think that you're just two very different types of historical enthusiasts. I think
because
he doesn't have much respect for the finer points, and he likes to make like these sort of broad strokes that build up very cool narratives. As you're much more of a sort of finer points man.
Yeah, I do like to get my facts straight, I must admit. I mean, look, I would fully agree that Thomas 777 has a broad degree of understanding of what's gone on for like quite a long time, but he makes a lot of errors, in my opinion. You know, so yeah. But I was glad Lady of Shalott, who's in my Discord, was on that stream, because I think she kept it real, because she was a Protestant young girl back then, and actually lived through some of it. I mean, I did 2 tours in Northern Ireland, British Army, so like I like to think I've got some knowledge of it. And I absolutely agree with what Lady of Shalott, I believe, said, which was that, you know, the Good Friday Agreement, which was brokered by that scumbag Clinton in America as much as anything else, saved the provisional IRA from destruction, because they'd been so thoroughly penetrated by British intelligence. And it released loads of murderers and bombers from prison. And up until only less than 2 years ago, British soldiers who are now old men were still being prosecuted for stuff that had gone on in that war, which was ridiculous, in my opinion. But again, another example, no special relationship. That was designed to help the Irish, not the Brits, you know, and not the loyalist Brits in Northern Ireland either. So the whole special relationship thing is bollocks. And that is one thing that Buchanan brings out beautifully, particularly as he is an educated American. And with his name, I'm guessing he's probably got some Irish ancestry too. So, you know.
And if the river of money that's flown from Irish Americans to you know, Sinn Féin and other organisations I won't name, if that was happening, you know, say from Palestinian Americans to Hamas, they wouldn't have accepted that, but they were quite happy for. Plenty of Irish American politicians have used their position as well to help support the IRA and stuff.
Or Horus, there were Ulster Protestant Irish in America who hadn't been following stuff, because they just moved to America, you know, 100 years previously, who were giving money to NORAID, which was basically giving money to the Provisional IRA. And they didn't even realize they were giving money for their own people to get killed.
Grubby way to behave by NORAID. I hadn't heard of that before. So, also, but it's quite amazing how many Irish have had a big impact on America. I mean, obviously Ronald Reagan was descended from Irish, I think, and John F. Kennedy as well, Irish descended, right? Irish Catholic descended, I think.
Yeah.
But I don't know if either of those were particularly hostile to the Protestants, but.
All right, Horus, you sent me a couple of things before we started this stream yesterday from the Mises Institute. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Now I watched one all the way through and one halfway through, and I've got to say this: I can't see the chap's position that Britain got everything she wanted in 1918, because Britain was immeasurably weaker in 1918 than she had been prior to World War One in 1930. Immeasurably weaker, financially, militarily, and in all respects you can possibly think of. Well, maybe not militarily, I guess, but in all real respects, Britain was immeasurably weaker in 1918 than she had been prior to World War One. So the idea that this chap came up with in his speech to the Mises Institute, where he said, "Oh, Britain got everything she wanted at the Treaty of Versailles," I cannot agree with that at all, to be honest.
So just for the benefit of Ataman and the audience, this is two speeches that I just forwarded on to Duke. One, they're both by John Denson, as he said, at the Mises Institute. The first one's called 6 Months That Changed the World. And the second one, I think it was Roosevelt on the policy of unconditional surrender. You're referring to the first one, which is about the Versailles Conference. And I presume John Denson wouldn't disagree with what you've said there, that it was terribly costly to understate it for Britain. I think his point in emphasising the gains that Britain made, which is, certain mandates were handed to the British Empire, and it gained land, especially from Germany, was that I think he was saying that the treaty was unfair. That obviously, I presume he would agree that everyone who was involved, even the USA, suffered a terrible human cost and an unprecedented monetary cost. I mean, this was obviously it was during the First World War that the gold standard came to an end, and when the gold standard came to an end, that means all pre-existing restraints on spending, where you actually needed to be concerned with balancing your budget over time. They were all gone. Monetary printing became a thing. What that really means is that every nation then begins to sink into debt, and we're coming to some sort of crisis point of that right now. I think with America in
for sure, yeah, like
$30 trillion of debt plus hundreds of trillions in unfunded liabilities. It's not going to be paid back, right? So I think he would agree that the costs of the war were appalling. Obviously, maybe I presume Germany suffered the worst, but I mean Russia was in a diabolical state. Britain and France, Britain probably got off less badly than France, but still terrible. And crucially, obviously, we ended up to the tune of billions, I think, even in those days numbers, billions of pounds in debt to America, which in some ways gives them...
all right, yeah, okay. Let me just interrupt you a little bit there, Horus. Britain owed a lot of money to America because America was making ammunition and what have you for Britain during World War One, which Britain should have been doing for France rather than actually being in the war. But
and the loans I meant as well.
But Britain did owe America money in World War One, but Britain was able to pay down its debts even in the 1920s and 30s faster. Much faster than we could possibly do today. You were talking. I mean, I agree that the position Britain's in today, and America's in today, and all Western nations are in today, is impossible in the long term. Like, we're going to head into a recession, even without stuff like shooting yourself in the foot, like net zero and the Russian sanctions and all this crap. But in the 1920s and 30s, Britain, unlike, say, France or Italy, who owed Britain money, by the way, which they stopped paying, Britain was in a much better position. Britain was able to pay down its debts and still have like quite a lot of spare money. People often turn around and say Britain was bankrupted by World War One. Not true. Britain was put in a much poorer position by World War One than it had been, but Britain was still in a pretty strong position even in the 1920s. Britain, we're going to come on to the Washington Naval Treaty. Britain could have done a naval race with the Americans in the 1920s and would not necessarily have lost, especially given that we started with an enormous advantage in numbers of warships. So, yeah, there's that. I don't know if that's the real academic agent in the chat,
it's
but
not.
I
know who it is.
yeah, I somewhat doubt that it is to myself, because like the academic agent's understanding of history is fairly limited, to be honest. So I'm not sure he'd come on a history channel, but we'll see. But yeah, I would say that yeah, Britain did owe American money, but the British and Empire economy was strong enough that we were able to pay that back and still have a surplus. So, yeah.
All right, yeah, that's like almost unimaginable today, isn't it? When was the last time Britain had a surplus? It was like 20 years ago or something, and like for 1 year.
Yeah, well, I mean, just after 1981 or something, I don't know. But yeah, something like
that. About the state of bankruptcy, though, I mean, like Britain and, well, every country, I think, including America, which obviously came out of the First World War by far the best of all the...
Yeah, because they spent most of the war just building armaments for other nations.
Yeah, just watching us destroy ourselves.
Which indeed they did for almost half of World War II, one might say. But yeah,
it's an enormous advantage for them to stay out as long as they could and just join at the end. That was like the perfect play in terms of like geopolitics. They played that brilliantly if that was intentional. But in terms of bankruptcy, I mean, I don't know. Maybe I'm straying too far into sort of finance and economics here, but like, it does bear upon your ability to build arms after the war, obviously. But in terms of bankruptcy, I'd say as soon as everyone moved off the gold standard, they all became bankrupt. And it's just a question of degree and how close you can get to that sort of panic point where the credit availability suddenly contracts, as obviously it did in 2008, and as I think it's going to do in the next few years, even more severely. You move on to a thing where confidence matters more than the actual number of pounds or the amount of gold that you've got, and to be in debt in that instance is a very precarious thing. I mean, it kind of puts you. Maybe I'm talking nonsense here. I'm not quite sure, but it puts you, I think, in a position where you're you act at the behest of who you're in debt to. Although it's not as simple as that, because obviously if you default, the creditor is the one who loses. But like, yeah, I think it's in one way it's impossible to go bankrupt once you move on to the fiat standard, because you can just keep inflating. On the other hand, that inflation, as Weimar Germany learned, it can run away and it can destroy your existing monetary arrangement, and as it turned out in Germany, destroys the existing ruling class and clears the way for something far more unscrupulous, you could say, on right and left. So, I mean, in terms of how that bears upon Britain's ability to, keep up navally after the war, I'm not that clear, but certainly when it comes to the naval treaty, that seems to have been a disastrous decision. For those who don't know, that was 1922. And Britain had this alliance, 21 years old, I think, with Japan. And that had been a very, very useful alliance. It allowed Britain to keep very limited naval forces in the Far East. And even, in terms of, you didn't have to do a lot to defend Australia and New Zealand, which are large territories and, very important colonies as well, or dominions, sorry. The Japanese naval treaty, I think that's the really important thing, as Buchanan would have it anyway, is that the Washington Naval Treaty directly replaced the treaty with the alliance with Japan, which had done a lot for the British Empire. The Washington Naval Treaty basically antagonized Japan lost us the benefit of that alliance because they were sort of, largely protecting places like Hong Kong and Singapore and so on, and it put us at the behest of America navally in terms of the Pacific and so on. And America was not not a solid or dependable ally in that way. America
totally agree.
Yeah,
I mean, it's a bigger deal than that, but I totally agree with what you say there.
Yeah, please add to it. But I would just add one more thing: was that Woodrow Wilson was very explicit, I think, and this goes back further as well. Woodrow Wilson was explicitly what he called anti-imperialist, right? And that meant, let's dissolve
self-determination.
Right. And of course, neoconservatives now refer to themselves as Wilsonians sometimes,
God, yeah. I mean, how they can call themselves conservatives, I don't understand.
It's a complete subversion of the word, right? America, I think, has never been a good ally for Britain, and certainly after they had this explicit policy. I just have one thing to that.
Ever has America been a good ally for Britain? Ever.
No. And Buchanan mentions, as one example of that, the Republicans in 1900 almost, it was just voted down at the last second, but almost put a clause in their election manifesto or whatever they call it, platform, to annex Canada.
Well, they wanted to, yeah, but they had a bad history. The War of 1812 didn't go well for the Americans trying to invade Canada, so they kind of didn't do it anymore. But they still had a plan to do it in the 1930s.
Right, in the 30s.
In the 1930s, they still had a war plan against the British Empire to try and invade Canada.
Special relationship. It's a relationship for
special relationship. You have to be specially stupid to believe in it if you're British.
It's one of those friendships where you just suddenly get your territories taken off you. Yeah.
Well, it's a bit like if you and I were mates and we both liked the same really cute girl, but like you had a plan that you were going to stab me in the back immediately. I had anything to do with it. That's what the British and American special relationship is. It's just a joke,
I won't do that, by the way. I never try and take
I'm using that as an example. Right? But yeah.
We've got a treaty anyway, so.
Yeah. Ataman, I don't know, man. Look, you're the guy in the middle on this, because I'm no Winston Churchill fan. So the one reason you're on here is to give us a bit of balance. What's your opinion on this stuff, man? Hang on. Maybe I'm missing something. Ataman, are you about, mate?
Yeah, I'm back. Sorry about that.
Oh, that's okay, man. No worries. Listen, as I said, you're kind of on here to give us a bit of balance. What's your opinion on this?
What were you discussing?
Look, we're talking about like the special relationship between Britain and America was always. There was no special relationship. America wanted to destroy the British Empire.
Well, yeah, I mean, this is kind of the problem. I kind of agree with all of that. I'll be honest.
I agree. It's difficult not to if you read any history, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to play devil's advocate for Churchill, but the more I went through the book, the less I think I was able to do that. So
yeah. And of course, Churchill was half American. He wasn't totally British.
And I've always kind of felt that was where part of his sympathies for the whole thing came from.
Yeah, what do you think there, Horus? I always think that Churchill's basically upper class whore of a mother, which is what she effectively was. Really, who he adored, by the way. I think that really twisted him into supporting the Americans rather than the Brits in most respects.
I absolutely think the same. I guess to add potential nuance to it, though, is that when it comes to the Washington Naval Conference and Treaty, particularly, that seems to have been agreed to by the cabinet after some pretty intense debate. And it was Churchill along with Arthur Balfour, who was sort of, I don't know what his motivation was, but he believed in this stuff as well, and so did Austin Chamberlain. I mean, Arthur Balfour was very like Christian Zionist. I don't know whether that had something to do with it, because obviously that's a very powerful force in the US. But yeah, like it seems to have been the cabinet as a whole, with a lot of dissenting voices, who agreed to this thing, and thus must have been either ignorant or had this complacent attitude towards the USA, which is completely unjustified. They must have had strange reasons, because there was no basis in fact for thinking that the Americans would be good allies, whereas the Japanese had proven over 20 years that, although they were quite hostile to other nations, they were quite a faithful ally of Britain, and it worked for Japan.
The Japanese were absolutely, totally faithful allies to Britain, and in World War One, even sent warships into the Mediterranean to help the British.
Right.
They
helped ship troops as well, didn't they? They helped ship Australian troops.
They helped convoy Australian and New Zealand soldiers from the Pacific to Europe. And they captured a load of Germans in some of the German colonies in China, and treated their prisoners perfectly well, by the way.
This is Buchanan emphasizes this, doesn't he? He says that, although Japan's culture and certainly the way their politics was moving at this, during the 20s and certainly in the 30s, was very, very militaristic, and sort of they treat, in later decades they came to treat civilians in various countries terribly.
Yeah.
He says that this treaty had the effect of kind of binding them to what are perhaps Western or British practices and the rule of law.
The Japanese admired the British, who were also an island people with a powerful navy and warriors, just like the Japanese were. And the Anglo-Japanese naval agreement and then the Anglo-Japanese naval treaty after that kept the Japanese on the straight and narrow as being one of the better nations in the world. And Britain getting rid of it was a disaster. And the number one dude who pointed this out was the Australian Labor Prime Minister, Billy Hughes.
So he's actually a leftist, too.
Yeah, well, he was the Labor Prime Minister, but he was an absolute... Billy Hughes was also absolutely white Australia policy, and he was also totally pro-empire. And he turned around and said to the Americans and to the British, you're going to give up an actual alliance with the Japanese for no alliance with the Americans. He said, listen, if the Americans are offering us an alliance, I'll take an alliance with the Americans rather than the Japanese. But the Americans were not offering us an alliance. They were just saying, stop your alliance with Japan. And that was what really the Washington Naval Treaty was signed.
It all worked in America's favour without really binding them to any sort of help for us in, when we needed it. So it's a terrible arrangement.
Billy Hughes turned around and said, are the Americans going to come and defend Australia or New Zealand or any of the other British colonies in the Pacific? And he answered his own question and said, no, they're not. So why should we get rid of this alliance with Japan, who will come and defend those places? And you have to say, as a guy using common sense, he was absolutely correct.
I think it's a complete blunder. Maybe the problem was that it was decided by the cabinet, whereas maybe it should have been decided just by the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary. I don't know, but because you're letting sort of your employment. I don't know what. I was going to say your employment secretary, but that probably didn't exist back then. But you're asking irrelevant politicians to decide on something which actually does require some degree of specialized knowledge and understanding of history. I mean, I'm sure this happens quite a lot of things, but Buchanan sort of zeroes in on Winston Churchill's influence on this. Obviously, his input at the time of the conference was very much like, this is what the Americans want, so let's go along with that. But later on, as Chancellor, he also kind of compounded this mistake. Because, Buchanan says it may have been that he became Chancellor thanks to Stanley Baldwin personally, And he thought, and obviously, he thought that the best way to sort of repay his favour was to do the job of Chancellor very well, but that meant at the expense of the Admiralty, because the Admiralty being one of the greatest expenses of the government.
He cut the Royal Navy and British defence generally to the very bone, and was the biggest supporter of the 10-year rule in the government. And for people listening or watching this, the 10-year rule in the 1920s and 30s was that Britain assumed in, 1923 or something, that there would be no major war for the next 10 years. And that's okay. The trouble was that what happened with the 10-year rule, largely because of Winston Churchill, was it just got extended every year. So there was never going to be a war for the next 10 years. And it went on, 22, 23, 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. Never going to be a war for the next 10 years, which is obviously insane. And Winston Churchill totally supported that shit.
The letter in, sorry.
I was just going to say, I think it's also worth pointing out that the Japanese relationship with us was deep enough that Prince Edward was having golf games with Hirohito.
Yeah. I mean, Japan was mortally offended in 1922 when Britain said, we're not going to renew the Anglo-Japanese naval agreement. And the reason we didn't was because the Royal Navy and the Japanese Navy between them were much stronger than the American Navy. And the Americans said, no, you got to get rid of that or we won't have a naval treaty. Now, I would have turned around and said, okay, we won't have a naval treaty. And Britain would build the G-Freeze and the N-Freeze, which were two classes of enormously powerful ships, that, along with the vast advantage the Royal Navy had in terms of numbers of ships overall, would have meant the Americans couldn't have caught us up. But that's not what happened.
I do think, though, that it's worth pointing out
people like Churchill prevailed and said, oh no, we're just going to reduce our fleet to the size of the American Navy, which is really what the Washington Naval Treaty was really about.
Yeah, but I do also think that it was also just the case that they probably thought at the time with debts as they were and all that it was just easier to restrict everyone else to some extent rather than keep trying to chase this goal of naval superiority when everyone else was trying to.
There was no chasing. Britain had an enormous naval superiority in 1922, which we totally gave away at the Washington Naval Treaty.
Right, but to have kept it going with everyone building up, it would have.
Who was everyone building up? There was only the Americans and the Japanese.
And the Japanese.
Oh yeah, and the Japanese were our
and the
allies.
Italians wanted to.
Well, okay, but the only real people with big navies in 1922 were Britain, America, and Japan. Japan was our ally, so they could build up as much as they liked, couldn't they?
Mm.
So who were we concerned with? The
thing is, I'm not sure if you can really. I mean, you're like the depth of the relationship is great and all, but there's always going to be an extent of worries of deception and treachery.
What, with the Japanese you're talking about?
Well, yeah, with anyone.
What? But why? What would the Japanese gain from that?
Well, British overseas territories that are too far away.
No. Look, this is what I find difficult about this kind of thing. Britain in 1922 the Royal Navy had roughly 2.5 times as many battleships as the American Navy. Just battleships, and it was the same for cruisers and destroyers and all the rest of it, submarines, what have you. But basically 2.5 times the number of battleships of the Americans. We gave that away for nothing. For nothing. We not only gave that away for nothing, we lost our Japanese ally. And if you were looking at this, say you were looking at this as a business deal, you would have gone, I'm pretty sure, what the fuck are we gaining here?
Well, I just think it was the aim of the politicians at the time who thought that they could tie other powers down instead of having to build up.
But what I'm trying to get across here, and I have never worked it out really, although I've looked at this stuff for the last, I don't know, 30 years. Britain was gaining nothing; it was losing everything. I.e., like the reason Britain and the British Empire was the most powerful nation in the world prior to World War One was the Royal Navy. And we gave it away in the early 1920s. We just gave it away.
Right,
We
but the thing
didn't
is
even
that
fight for it.
there was but there was quite a prevailing view at the maybe not at that time, but in the
There
years
was a prevailing view of Americans that you shouldn't do this, but like, I'm not American, forgive me. So
no, what I was going to say was there was a prevailing view in the years preceding that it was the naval arms race above all that sort of escalated things to World War One to begin with.
Well, only if you were a lefty. Only if you were a lefty. No one else thought that. I mean, the sheer fact was that in World War One, the German Navy came out in full strength once in 1916, and was very, very lucky to not be totally destroyed and get back into port, and never came out again. So the whole British naval supremacy thing was kind of vindicated.
I think I suspect America's thinking was that they were pretty confident. Sorry, go on.
Sorry, I was just going to say, I know what America's thinking was let's destroy the Royal Navy. That was America's thinking.
Right, but, and they wanted to become top dog, yeah. And I think, like, with their industrial power and their resources, their natural resources, they probably knew that in the long term they could become top dog just by spending more. They could just sustain that level of spending, you know.
The American Congress in the 1920s were not willing to do that.
Right. And this was a way of getting parity without having to fight that political fight.
Absolutely right. And also, the Royal Navy, who was good at this stuff, we'd been doing it for 150 years, had already worked out that, we were going to build 4 G-free battle cruisers and 4 N-free battleships. I might have got that the wrong way around. But anyway, they were extremely powerful warships that the Americans basically couldn't match. And we already were starting with, about 30 more battleships than the Americans had. So there was no way they were going to catch up. Unless the Americans wanted to spend basically up their whole budget on the American Navy.
I think that's what it was, because I think that their thinking was, we can, over the long term, we can catch up and overtake Britain in how much, we and they are prepared to spend on military stuff, and especially Navy, which is valuable to both countries. And they just thought, well, let's just try and avoid doing that spending. I mean, we can handle it, but why take that cost? Yeah. Why not rather just hold down the overall level? Yeah.
Instead, let's get rid of the Anglo-Japanese naval agreement, which was obviously going to be had Britain and Japan both gone to war against America, that wouldn't have been very good for America. Let's get rid of that, and let's also make the British scrap all of their battleships. They have more than us, so that both countries end up with just 15, which is what the Washington Naval Agreement ended up doing.
And it helped sort of put an end to a large part of Britain's shipbuilding industry, and helped depress the coal industry as well, and probably oil as well.
Totally correct, mate. Totally
if you're like an American strategist around this time, I suppose when you look out over the world, right, you know that Britain is friendly towards you, but all the same, it is a potential rival, and it's one of the nearest countries to you that's of any concern, not including South America and that. And then you look over, you look across the Atlantic, who's potentially a problem? Britain, France, Spain wasn't really a factor. Germany was only a factor if they could break out.
America in the 1920s and 30s had war plans against two nations. One was Japan, the other was Britain.
So breaking that alliance was such a great prize for them, such a moment of victory. And then when we just left with this mystery of why British politicians convinced themselves that this was a good thing, we've gone some way to answering that, but it's still something of a mystery, isn't it?
Now, listen, if you read Patrick Buchanan's book, and obviously Patrick Buchanan is an American, he makes this very clear in his book. The American aim in the 20s was the destruction of British naval power, and particularly the destruction of British naval superiority. Like, Britain was probably still marginally the largest and most powerful fleet up until, I don't know, beginning of 1943, but only just. Whereas in 1922, the Royal Navy was vastly bigger. Like, the Royal Navy was bigger in 1922 than the American and French fleets put together.
Yeah. Yeah, it was old to have those days back,
Well, that was, instead of spending our money on the National Health Service, the British spent their money on warships. Britain could still have a vastly powerful navy, but these days it mostly goes on the National Health Service. Is the real truth.
And obviously, part of our navy is the Trident system, and doesn't Britain kind of rely on American permission to actually use the nuclear weapons?
No.
Is that not true?
No, that's not true. It's a fiction. Britain can launch those things anywhere they like.
That's good.
I don't think it matters because no one's going to use them unless you all want to die. But I mean,
you need to know that you can, though, don't you? You need to know that whether you really have that option.
Well, look, if Britain gets in a war if China decides they want to take out London, or Russia decides they want to take out London, I kind of think that was all right, apart from the old buildings, because there's not many. There's not many real British people in London anymore.
There's some of us
I was born in London, and honestly, I'd regret the old buildings. I wouldn't give a shit about the people living there.
This place is fucking glowing.
Who are mostly immigrants, but
I'm picturing like Fallout London. I don't know if you've ever played the Fallout games.
Yeah, no, I never have. But if
great game.
As I said, if Russia or China wants to take out London, I would regret the old nice buildings and not give a shit about the immigrants who live there. But that's just me,
If we've still got pictures, we can rebuild the buildings in the 3100 or whatever.
I doubt it, but yeah. But the point is, if China or Russia want to do that, well, okay, we can take out Beijing, Peking, or we can take out St. Petersburg and Moscow, and I'm sure we will. So I don't think that'll happen, hopefully. But
you take out Beijing, there's only 12 yuan's worth of damage, so don't worry about it.
Yeah, but I mean, all right, we can take out Shanghai as well. I reckon the Royal Navy can probably take out, I don't know, the top half a dozen cities of China or Russia if they have to. But really, that shouldn't be in the Royal Navy budget because it's not what the Royal Navy does. The Royal Navy budget should be for aircraft carriers, aircraft on those carriers, frigates and destroyers, and hunter-killer SSN submarines rather than boomers, So, whatever. And the Royal Navy's half the size it should be at present under the so-called Conservative government. But we're getting a long way away from what we're talking about.
I actually have to finish at the top of the hour, but one thing we could mention in connection with this is obviously when the Second World War was underway. I think this was in 1940. There was the destroyers deal, wasn't there? Do you know much about that?
Yeah, it was bullshit. Britain gave the Americans a load of bases in the Caribbean, etc., and got 50 useless American destroyers in return. and they really were useless. They were.
It was all World War One stock, wasn't it?
Yeah, they were all 1918 destroyers.
I think the best use they had for them was they used one of them as a giant floating bomb to blow up the dry dock at Saint-Nazaire. Yeah,
Saint-Nazaire. Yeah, absolutely. That was the best use any of those destroyers got.
What was it used to blow up? Sorry,
it was they blew up a dry dock at Saint-Nazaire that was going to house the Tirpitz.
That could have housed Tirpitz or a German battleship, basically. So the Royal Navy ran it into the dry dock, landed a load of Royal Marines, and blew the fucking thing to smithereens.
Nelson will be proud of that, I think.
Oh, absolutely! It was a great battle.
There's a good little documentary of it that's on YouTube by it's of an old TV show with Jeremy Clarkson presenting it.
Oh yeah,
that people should check out. It's pretty good.
Yeah, it's good. Go and check that one out. It ain't bad. There are others as well, but yeah, the Brits just blew that bloody thing to shit. But that was the best use of any of those destroyers, which were all crap. They were old-fashioned and rubbish. And the person who accepted that was, of course, Winston Churchill.
And he was sad. He was disappointed in how cold the Americans were, how sort of like unhelpful. That they took the highest price that they possibly could for these ships that were just barely usable, as you say, right?
Yeah.
Well, you actually said useless, didn't you?
But pretty useless. They were pretty useless. Yes.
And Churchill on that occasion, and I think on several others, was like, why are the Americans being like this? It's like, well, why wouldn't they be? Why would they? Like you've gone pleading to them at your weakest moment. Like that's the worst negotiating stance you could possibly have. Why would they not squeeze you? It's just Churchill's bizarre.
Half American, mate. Half American.
Yeah, he literally confused the two countries.
He did not see we were different people.
Right.
In my opinion, in my humble opinion.
And I would say, I mean, maybe this is controversial. Maybe I'm sort of opening us up to a whole nother debate here. But I would say, in a lot of ways, we do. It's strange. Perhaps this is wrong. I don't know. But we do have a lot more in common with our sort of nearer neighbours, even though they speak other languages and they've got different philosophy and stuff.
I don't agree with that.
Well, maybe I'm taking us back a couple of years to the sort of split between sort of PA and 37.
I don't agree with that, but that's my own opinion.
They can set us off for hours more.
Did you say you've got to go at the top of the hour, mate?
I had already planned to finish at 10. So,
All right, let's.
But I'm really enjoying this, so I'm happy to talk more about other things on another occasion if you guys like.
Oh man, I'll have you on again. This was an interesting stream. And
history is where it's at. It's the juicy stuff. I love it.
Oh, listen, I would like to become the good British stream, but I mean, I try my best. Let's put it this way. But I'll happily have you on again, Horus. But I would just say before you go that if you're going to look at what we're talking about here, and we didn't really get into the third part of the discussion because I started a bit late, that Churchill never realized Britons and Americans are not the same people. We're just not. We don't have the same interests at all. And what we have these days is Britain following along behind the Americans like some sort of miniature poodle lapdog, which I detest, quite honestly. But there we go.
That's something that Peter Hitchens has done a good job of talking about. Maybe that's a potential topic for another stream, is talking about the phony victory and other writings of his where he is aware of that stuff. I mean, he's quite pro-American in some ways, but he does say there's this imagined friendship has not worked out well for us. In terms of when you meet American people, some of them are, like lovely, like, really nice.
I have
political class.
Horus, I have good American friends like Don the Pleb, for example. I really like Don the Pleb. He's an ex-US Marine Corps artillery dude, and he's a good man. I like him a lot. And before Don the Pleb, I had ex-American military mates who I liked, who were good men. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about governments.
Yeah. One thing that in the series of videos that I made about the Second World War, I based one of the videos partly on this book by Benjamin Ginsberg. Forgive me, but this is the title, and this is a mainstream book, and he is a Jewish writer himself, and he's a mainstream, he's not a renegade Jew or anything, but the book is called How the Jews Defeated Hitler. As I say, it's a mainstream book, right? He talks in that, the main subject of the book, you can guess from the title, but he also talks about how the American ruling class really turned against its own people. He says, like, this is from a pro-Jewish perspective. He says that, like, the American sort of WASP elite, people like the Dulles family, the Morgan family, the Rockefellers, they were happy to make an alliance with what they saw as, like, well, with Jews, but we're still talking elite, sort of ruling class Jews as well, against, sort of basically with contempt for the American people. So when the American people were isolationist between the two world wars, that was something for people like Morgan, Dulles, and so on, Averell Harriman, the Roosevelt family and stuff, and all their other allies, to defeat and to overcome. And obviously Pearl Harbor enabled them to do that, and there's a lot of claims about Pearl Harbor that I think are very likely true. Also the Lusitania, right, which we've not mentioned, but I think that's a very interesting theory, and I think the same goes in Britain. Like, the ruling class has to be sharply distinguished from the people. Again, in the Second World War, it began in 1939, and still by the summer of 1940, Winston Churchill found it necessary to launch the anger campaign to basically stir up hatred of Germany and to justify bombing of German cities. That's another can of worms that we could talk for hours about, so I won't start in on that. But
all right, look, Horus, just to be clear, I believe there is some truth in the JQ stuff, especially in America. I think it's far less in Britain.
Sure.
In general terms, like, I think there are good, bad, and indifferent Jews, just like there are good, bad, and indifferent Gentiles. I
brought it up to make a point about class.
Yeah.
It just happens to be that writer was the one who sort of elucidated that.
I get what you're saying, and I didn't interrupt you. And I'm just saying, I think there are more Anglo-Celtic anti-Brits in the British government than there are Jewish ones, and I strongly suspect the same is probably true in America, to be honest.
Yeah. Maybe not the current administration, but before that.
Yeah. I mean, in some ways, I quite admire Israel. Israel's kind of an ethno-state, and I would kind of like our guys to be a bit more like that. So, that's my view on that stuff, to be honest. Ataman, you haven't said any phrases. Well, you're right.
Yeah. Let's be more like Israel. No, I mean that unironically. Like, what is it? What's that? What's that line? The sun goes up and it goes down. It was necessary. Israel.
That's Menachem Begin, right?
Yeah.
Unabashed nationalism. We did what we needed to do. That's that.
Didn't he orchestrate the assassination of, like, a West German chancellor, and they covered it up?
Yeah, I can believe that. I think. The times I've got in arguments with Jewish guys from Israel have been when I've turned around and said, "Well, I didn't like the fact you killed British NCOs in 1948." That's when I get fucked off with them. Oh, we're going to hang 2 British sergeants we captured in 1948 because when we blew up the King David Hotel and killed loads of women and kids, that wasn't good enough. Wasn't
that a Jewish Labour MP that gave them that information?
Yeah, it could well be, man. Could well be.
I've heard that as well. I can't remember.
I mean,
Emmanuel Shinwell, yeah.
Right.
Yeah, Emmanuel Shinwell, scumbag.
Who's an ancestor of Ruth Smith as well.
Yeah, and Maxwell, for God's sake. And we all know who Maxwell's daughter is, who's now sitting in prison in America. But, it's got nothing to do with anything, guys. Don't look over there.
Sorry, I think I got that wrong. I think he was an ancestor of Luciana Berger, who's no longer in Parliament. Sorry, I didn't mean to swing all this round, to a certain topic. By the way, it was Benjamin Ginsberg who brought that theory. So
yeah, look, I am not. I do believe there's some truth in the JQ. I don't believe it's the major reason why the West is destroyed. because I'm not a victim culture poor guy who's just being controlled by that tiny number of Jewish people. Don't believe that. I think it's bollocks, frankly. And also, there are also some pretty good Jewish people who are like pointing out some of the good things. David Cole, for example. You know David Cole, don't you, Horace?
Not sure.
He's a mate of Irving.
Oh, right, yeah. Sorry, yeah. He's quite a funny guy.
Yeah. He is a funny guy. He's got a good channel on YouTube.
Mm.
He thinks like maybe 3.5 million Jews were killed by the Germans rather than 6, but doesn't matter. Although that could get us cancelled on YouTube, by the way. Just saying.
I know. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I know. But it doesn't matter. Paul Gottfried, John Comenos. Paul Gottfried is another Jewish guy who wrote the book about Italian fascism, which is nothing whatever to do with German National Socialism. Presume you'd agree with that, Horace. Like, Italian fascism was not the same at all. And in fact, there were many Italian Jews who were fascists.
And there was also Mussolini's mistress as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it's a distinct phenomenon, and like studying Mussolini's turn to fascism away from socialism is, I think, more instructive. It's a more sort of easy to understand story of how socialism split into, because obviously it was always sort of a left-wing movement. But Mussolini found during the war that he was surrounded by people who weren't supporting their own nation. And who were even beginning to, question the value of families and of society itself, really. And so Mussolini, like, I think when you examine the emergence of fascism in Italy, it really helps us understand the whole of the last century, because he saw up close, in terms of people he'd been working with closely for years, he saw them turn basically towards this extreme left-wing sort of nation-destroying, society-destroying ideology called communism. And he had what I would say is a natural reaction against it. I mean, I'm not a fascist myself, but it's like, you're threatened by a seditious, dissolving force. And so you resort to something overtly and sort of macholy solid, and about binding society together, hence the fasces, right? It's like that you can understand why that emerged. It's not this demonic force that we're told about from the Second World War. It goes back to when all of Europe was under threat. So yeah, I think that's very interesting. Again, it's another thing we could discuss for hours, but I do have to go now. But I'll just reply to one comment from the chat. Marco Coletti Spaghetti says, ask Horus, what does he think of the Churchill statue? Look, this is not something I'm bashful about. I absolutely do want to take down Churchill's statues. I think he was a terrible, terrible leader, even just from the sense that he wasn't a good minister. So that's not an own, right? Like I'm quite open.
Yeah, but I presume, Horace, you don't support Black Lives Matter and the scum who want to take that.
No, I was talking to my friend about this the other day, right? No, when they wanted to take it down, I would quite happily stand there and keep it up. You don't want to take it down from the left, from the anti-British, anti-white, anti-European side. No way.
Fair enough. Then I agree with you.
To hell with them. Yeah, I said it at the wrong time, probably, but
Yeah, no, it was a while back that he asked. Listen, I tell you, I started off, as you know, Horus, as a 37 dude, a 37 words dude, and I'm still basically a 37 words dude. I still think, Britain and the British Empire was the best thing since sliced bread, and I haven't changed in that respect.
Yeah, who had a better empire than Britain?
But yeah, nobody did, and like. Where I have slightly changed is in my realization that what really mattered about the British Empire was the old Commonwealth, which is to say Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and back in the day South Africa, as well as Britain, of course. And that is the bit that Britain should have built up.
Well, I'm making a new series of videos about how Britain got involved with the European community and the European Union, and that is a story.
What a disaster that was.
And betrayal of New Zealand and Australia and Canada as well.
Oh, yeah, absolutely it was. We fucked over their farmers and everybody. But yeah, I will happily have you on again, Horus.
Cool.
I think this was an interesting talk. I apologize that it was half an hour late because we've missed a load of stuff we should have got onto, but we'll do it again. Ataman, your closing thoughts?
No, I've got nothing. I'm good.
You've always got something, Ataman. Come on.
Well, I was going to make a Dewey comment at the end as well, just to spite you, but it's all right. We can close on that.
Hang on. George in the chat says, Iron Duke, these streams is this guy went to university. I know he did. Iron Duke, these streams is basically a test for how quickly they can go Wignet. That's not true, mate. I'm not a Wignet. I'm never going to be a Wignet. It may be that Horus might be. I don't know. I think his position has changed.
I'm one of those Wignats whose favourite philosopher is Murray Rothbard, the Jewish libertarian from the USA. But yeah. Anyway.
Yeah. I look. The reason Horus is even on this stream is that I know his positions have changed a bit over the last couple of years. Like, had his positions been the same as they were 3 years ago, probably wouldn't have had him on it, to be honest. But I know his positions have changed a bit. So, George, Iron Duke, these streams is, in inverted commas, basically a test of how quickly they can go with that. George, you need to, learn to type better. No. Sorry. Oh my God, he's typing from his phone. Laugh at this user. Well, I just did that. He said that, and I just did. George, I like George, by the way. George's a man, mate. So I'm only being gently not kind to him. All right.
That Saint George? It's not the same one, is it? Do we have to read Jonathan Darwin?
I think that is his avatar. He's absolutely Saint George, who was, of course, a Greek-speaking Roman soldier in Anatolia years ago, and was most certainly not a Turk, as many left-wingers will try and claim every St. George's Day. But no, George is a good bloke, and I like him. I've known him for a long time. So thank you, Horus. Thank you, Armin. Thanks for coming on. And Horus, keep in touch, mate. I would like to do another stream with you. And you can even suggest the subject if you want. Okay.
Well, I'll make a tentative suggestion now. We could talk about the phony victory, but that's one out of several. So
yeah, absolutely. Because I was hoping we would get onto that in this stream, but it's like I was happy to go another hour, and you can't. So
Yeah, and I've read that book already, so it won't take me another 3.5 months to prepare.
That's all right. That's all right. No problem at all. Yeah, I would happily talk about that. I mean, the idea that Britain won World War II is, like, as a British person, is ridiculous, frankly.
We could also talk about Richard Evans's review of it, which I'll send you as well. Which Richard Evans being the grotesque toady of power. But anyway, good to meet both you guys. Good to have everyone in the chat as well. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, Ataman is a good friend of mine, and he's a good chap, and generally has a good and balanced view on most things. All right, guys, I'm very, very sorry that I was late. It was my fault. This stream was supposed to start at 5 a.m. I got up like 15 minutes late, so apologies. I was late and gay. Academic Agent does that every single week, and everyone thinks that's okay. So there we go. Go off, chaps. Obviously, on Saturday evening, UK time, Sunday morning, Eastern Australian time, we will have the next episode of Splendid Isolation, when we will be looking at the news and current events from a British and Old Commonwealth point of view, and we'll see you for that one. So go on, chaps and ladies.